Point 2 states the following: the state parties to the present covenant recognizing the fundamental right of everyone to be free from hunger. Right? The right, the fundamental right, recognizes everyone has a fundamental right to be free from hunger. Right? So, insofar as we're talking about the individual human being and his or her right to be free from, right? This is sort of worded in first generation terms, right? The ability to be free from, not the ability to be free to. So, to be free from, right? There's a right to be free from hunger. Obviously, this right corresponds to an obligation, a duty, to protect, right? To protect the population from hunger, right? And that duty, obviously, especially on a scale such as this, we're talking about an entire population of people, that obligation becomes, obviously, the duty and the obligation of the government, right? The government has the obligation, has the duty to protect its population from external, internal threats. And one of the threats that's not necessarily a threat, it is in a sense man-made, but it's not men, women, physical bodies attacking, is the threat of mass famine, mass starvation, and mass starvation as an act of genocide. Sort of, and I'll talk about Stalin's role in orchestrating a massive, and we all know this, right? Stalin's role in orchestrating a massive genocide based on mass starvation, right? So that you can weaponize, unfortunately you can weaponize anything, including starvation, right? You can weaponize starvation, and what we'll do at the end of this, what I'll do at the end of this, is show you how starvation was strategically weaponized as an act of calculated extermination, right? So unfortunately, it's the case that instances of starvation and food insecurity, if we recognize the pattern and we ask ourselves, why is the occurrence of starvation happening in this area, then we can see whether or not the causes for that famine, the causes for the starvation, are actually rooted in a strategic intent to destroy. If it is rooted in a strategic intent to destroy, i.e. genocide, then we have an international obligation to intervene on behalf of those who have been targeted for extermination. So just because we see sort of a spread of mass starvation and famine in an area doesn't mean that it's necessarily a natural occurrence. It could be the case that it is a calculated attempt to exterminate, and you can exterminate a massive portion of the population, tens of millions of people relatively quickly, if you strategize the system of mass starvation. I'll explain how Stalin actually did this in the extermination. Okay, so one thing with respect to desertification, loss of nutrients with respect to crops, failure to rotate crops properly, failure to irrigate crops properly, all of these things lead to starvation. And all of these things are pretty well documented. There is, however, a reason that is almost never documented. As a matter of fact, I did a bit of research in preparation for this video to see if anybody talked in all of YouTube, with all of the billions of videos that are on YouTube, if anybody talked about the distinction between subsistence farming and subsistence crops, or also known as consumption crops, and cash crops. And I couldn't find anything but one video. There was one video that talked about, in the billions of videos that are on YouTube, and it might have been bad browsing on my part, or maybe whoever uploaded the videos didn't tag them properly, but I only found one video that specifically talked about subsistence versus subsistence consumption crops, subsistence consumption farming, as opposed to cash crops, cash farming. I gave a link to the video because it's the only video that I found on the internet. Now my section will be the second video. So basically, how does this distinction between subsistence farming and consumption farming work? Okay, you imagine that you have a plot of land, and you have people. Let's say this is the This is the farm, and you have people who farm the land, right? If we're talking about, we're going to talk about two different, same land but two different seasons, right? Just for example's sake. So, if we're talking about cash crops, and if we're talking about consumption crops, and you can interchange consumption crops with subsistence crops, right? Subsistence crops or cash crops, subsistence crops or consumption crops versus cash crops. Okay, so we'll say indigenous population. I just finished the lecture series on, I spent about 3 hours discussing, maybe 2.5 hours discussing indigenous populations, so you should be sort of well informed on the role of indigenous populations. But you can imagine that indigenous, it doesn't have to be indigenous, but imagine that there's an indigenous population and they farm the land, and some of the products of the stuff that they farm, let's just say, for example, this is just an example, they get tomatoes, they get potatoes, they get yam, maybe some greens, right? So they harvest these crops, just as an example. Some of these are probably different seasons. I'm not a farmer, I don't know what can grow when, but this is what they get as a consequence of their harvest, right? This is what they harvest. And then what they do is they consume these crops, right? They eat these crops, right? So they farm the land, the farm produces these crops, they in turn use those crops, consume those crops, and they're able to sustain their life. These crops were designed specifically for consumption. Okay, and what'll end up happening is tomato season's in, so I plant tomato and then I harvest tomato, and then potato and yam season is in, and I plant. And what ends up happening is, not to get too technical, but each crop rotation allows the soil to regenerate itself. The nutrients aren't depleted. If I'm just harvesting potatoes, then I can deplete certain nutrients because all I'm pulling while I'm growing potatoes is the same nutrients, so that the ground runs the risk of becoming very fallow. So crop rotation is good, so that's a good thing. And so far as crop rotation is good, the soil is healthy, that's good. Not only is the soil healthy and the crops are being rotated, but the individuals are able to sustain their lives based on this crop rotation. That's good, so it's all around good. Now imagine another example. I don't know sort of the topography and geography needed to harvest this, but let's just say we want to, I'm approached by someone from a conglomerate, right, a coffee conglomerate, and I'm not going to, you fill in your favorite coffee, producer. And the coffee conglomerate comes and they talk to the local farmers, and they say, hey, we want you to stop using your farm to produce this stuff, and we want you to use your farm to produce cash crops, and we're willing to pay you, a good amount of money relative to the particular area that you live in to produce and to transform your land into a cash crop, a cash farm. Right? So the consequence is, let's say it's coffee, right? And they're going to give you money in order to get coffee, right? So you give us coffee, we give you money. That's how that works. Sounds like a good deal. Sounds like, whoa, wow, that's not a bad idea. I get to make a living for myself. I grow coffee, they come in, they own the coffee, and they give me money. The problem is, for these individuals, what happens time and time again with respect to food is that despite the fact that I'm producing so much food, all of this food is exported, right? All of this food is exported, and I don't get any sustenance from my land. My land has become monetized, right? I've monetized my land such that my land produces, let's say for example, coffee, rice, it can be anything. My land produces a cash crop. That cash crop is then exported to wherever it's going, and I receive monetary payment for that. Now the point is, well, how do I go out and get my food? Well, I have to use the money that I was given, right? I have to use the money that I was given in order to get my food. So you can imagine if the same retailer went to your neighbor and offered him money for his land to grow, and he said yes and offered him, you might have to travel a long way to get food now. Not only do you have to travel a long way, which is going to inconvenience